Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Manager for Dataversity. We would like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Data Management plus Data Strategy equals Interoperability. It is the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. And I'd especially like to thank you for understanding this very quick transition to a new platform. Unfortunately, we were not able to get speakers logged into WebEx due to a new bug and figured it was better to switch than to cancel. So feel free to send me a chat if you have issues with the platform and can't figure things out and need a little help navigating. And also that, I'll be here, of course, as always, to help you through this transition. And just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A section. So there's a separate section from the chat in the bottom middle of your screen. Or if you like to tweet, we encourage you to share highlights or questions via Twitter using #DataEd. And if you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. Just click the chat icon on the bottom right for that, or in the bottom middle, excuse me, for that feature. And to answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording and will likewise send a link of the recording of the session, as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce you our speaker for today, Dr. Peter Aiken. Peter is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. He has written dozens of articles and 11 books. The most recent is Your Data Strategy. Peter is experienced with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as a top data management expert. Some of his most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his expertise, and Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Peter, hello and welcome.
And hello and welcome to you, Shannon. It's a wonderful day on the East Coast here. We've got the redbud blooming and the dogwoods coming out. So hopefully you all are in some pleasant circumstances as well. Just a quick note, we've got some event pricing on the books that we're going to talk about, but what we're really here to talk about today, and let me also extend my thanks for switching platforms very quickly. Many of us are adept at these platform changes, so much so that I have an entire now metadata management scheme in my computer for managing these little conferences and things that we have to do on this. But what we're going to talk about today is that data management really is a really good thing to have, but data strategy is what enables you to help prioritize. And if you prioritize towards interoperability, you will succeed in a way that helps and other organizations perhaps haven't been able to do nearly as much with. So let's look at sort of 3 overall ideas on this. If things were not designed to work together in the first place, what are the chances that these things will just happen to work together? And my favorite example of this is an Army project that unfortunately gave 3 different SAP contracts to 3 different providers, and the chances, of course, that those 3 SAP systems spoke the same language was nil. In fact, they required a 4th SAP system to harmonize between the other 3. This is not good use of A, taxpayer money, B, fighter resources, and C, really not very good thinking in terms of interoperability. Although we do know the goal was precisely that. They achieved almost exactly the opposite, in fact. Second question is that data is literally the most atomic element. We can go down to an absolute 0 level in that area. And even though it's the most atomic element, it's the most underutilized, and it's the most, the least well-managed component that we have in here. When we look over on the right-hand side of this diagram, increasing organizational data leverage means we're going to start to introduce architectures and data collections. And these introduce dependencies, purposefulness, and intricacies into the process. And the third point is that we literally have not been teaching integration for the past 30 years. And so the only place that we can go to look for experience in these areas is the minds of the people who have done this already. Very important to keep these in mind as we roll forward here. So let's look at what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some important data properties. We're going to talk about data debt, and then particularly reversing data debt. Again, this lack of educational focus is fundamental to the problem. Then we can talk about data management. What is it? Why is it important? And most importantly, the state of the practice. Organizations are constantly surprised where they rank relative to other organizations in these areas. But there are some functions that are required for effective data management, and these are much more focused on capabilities than they are on technologies. The real key for that, the missing from the first piece, from the data management piece, is a unified approach to this. It's a structural approach, and it needs to be simple. You'll see why in just a bit. And that there are some foundational prerequisites that we have to pay attention to. Those of you that are familiar with a book called The Goal will recognize the theory of constraints at work here. It's a very good way of approaching the entire process. We'll talk about some takeaways and get to the Q&A at the end, but a key point of this is that if we can get both data management and data strategy to work together in concert, that is the thing that will help us with interoperability. So it's not just good to have one and good to have the other, but you actually have to get them both working at the same time, because coordination is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to success around data interoperability. Just to start out with, I love this particular piece, and I encourage everybody to go out and take a look at it as well. Domo.com every year puts out a bit that says, how much is happening every minute of the day. So let's just take a step back. We're on one of the 208,000 Zoom call participants every minute of every day for the entirety of 2020, and it's probably not much different for 2001. Interestingly, Netflix seems to have dropped in their number of hours streaming, which is kind of an interesting thing. We have not investigated those numbers. That's more of a question than a fact at this point. YouTube users uploaded lots of video. You get the idea on this. Amazon shipping tons of packages. So data is coming at us fast and furious. And yet we have to pay attention to the idea that many of this data pieces are not really useful for us. And of those that are useful for us, I hope we can all agree that data that is better organized increases in value. If you have anybody that doubts that particular statement, you can lead them to some examples that happened in organizing information long before the digital age. Imagine being handed a book without page numbers, without an alphabetical index, without a table of contents. These things would be very difficult. And I want to make sure I do a tip of my hat to Abby Covert for a wonderful book here called How to Make Sense of Any Mess. And in it, she makes the point that if you remove the binding of the book and have these pages just not connected and not sequential and other types of things, the knowledge vanishes very, very quickly around that. So data that is better organized increases in value, and poor data management practices, therefore, are costing our organizations money, time, and effort. And to add insult to injury, 80% of organizational data is rot. It is data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And the question, of course, comes up, which data do we eliminate? It's kind of like advertising, where we all know that 50% of all advertising dollars is wasted. We just don't know which 50%. Imagine if you could reduce your Amazon Web Services bill by 80%. That would actually something very tangible in terms of looking up. But of course, the question is which data to eliminate. And the fact, again, is that most enterprise data is not examined. So I've insulted data from start here, right, by saying we really need the good stuff. We don't necessarily want to get the bad stuff and all of that. Let's talk about some positive aspects of data, though. If we look, we can see that data assets are resources that are controlled by past events and transactions in which we expect future economic benefits to yield. The idea that data is still the most powerful, underutilized, poorly managed data asset can be even more well understood by understanding it's the sole non-depletable, non-degrading, durable asset that we have in our category of strategic assets. And it really wins when compared to other types of assets. There's all sorts of other wonderful descriptions of all of this. And yet we see over and over again that people say, yeah, data is the new oil. And I get a little bit riled up because oil is a production function. Data really needs to be focused on reuse. So I like to say data is the new soil. And there's two important characteristics here. One, you don't just fling seeds about the yard and expect good things to happen, although Mother Nature does a pretty darn good job of that. But also it takes time. And so nobody plants things on Monday and expects to eat them on Friday. So next time somebody says new oil, try and get them to back down a little bit. On the other hand, you do need some sizzle to sell data all the way around, as some people call it, the bacon. That'll be great. Data, regardless, as the sole non-depletable, non-degrading, durable strategic asset, deserves its own strategy. It needs attention on par with similar organizational assets, and it needs professional administration to make up for past neglect. This past neglect is what causes us to accumulate the data debt. Let's take a look at how organizations should start to understand themselves. When we look at this, I liken this to an organizational data machine. Now, the public has no idea that this is made up of a bunch of systems and blah, blah, blah. All the public sees is that inputs go into it and inputs go out of it. In fact, when you really take a step back, all the things that go into the organization are data inputs, and all the things that come out of the organization are data outputs. So the question for us is to determine what to manage formally and what to manage informally. If we put too many controls on, it becomes too expensive and requires bureaucracy on this. If we have too little, we miss opportunities. All the way around, these two related concepts are appearing in the new book that I'm almost done with on data literacy. One other concept to drop into here as well is that interoperability is a primary value determinant. The degree of interoperability is key to making sure that you make the right types of decisions, prioritizing your investments in data. One more additional concept, and we'll dive onto some properties here. And this is not just the idea of a data machine, but that there's this bigger piece called the data matrix behind us, which is just data that leaks from one data machine to another. And it happens, you know it. Again, you go through any sort of a search on something, and all of a sudden, all the search engines are offering you that item for sale, right? I mean, it's very simple, closed loop type of a process. The data matrix is important because there have been ways of figuring out how to get these things to work. So when lots of people come back and say this stuff is expensive and can't be justified, there are industries that are built on you continuing to believe in that particular approach. So we really do need to have better understanding of data properties all the way around. There's generally low data literacy rates in data specialists as well as in management as well. Lots of data does exist in this, but most of it is simply not valuable. But the good stuff is uniquely valuable, and that's an interesting dichotomy. Most of what exists has been created relatively recently. And organizations have not cared well for data. There are two worlds essentially that exist. I call them second world data challenges, and we'll drive into some of them like this. The first one is this concept of data debt. The time and effort that it's going to take your organization to return data from its current likely state of ungoverned to a governed state. And that's just simply making up for past mistakes, past neglect around this. Getting back to zero, if you will. It means undoing existing stuff, and likely new skills are required because we certainly haven't been teaching them in college and university. When you're at zero, then you could start from scratch. But if you're doing that, somebody's going to require an annual proof of value. Now, there's another concept going around here that says you shouldn't really use ROI. You should really look at sustained value. Any way that you can show it is good, but we do need to make it concrete. I think that's the important part, because now you need to get good at both getting your data back to zero and also making the improvements that are needed as the business goes through all of this. Almost all data challenges involve some form of interoperability. There's very little guidance around all of those, and none practically at this getting back to zero process. So of course, the first question pops up, what do we mean by a knowledge worker? And my definition of a knowledge worker is that they must use data, otherwise they're really not a knowledge worker. And therefore, all of them use it, but none of them are really taught anything about data. This is a challenge for us. We think we leave it to IT, and in the standard curriculum still, there is one course on how to build a new database. Believe me, if we could get rid of a skill that we have redundant skills of in the world, it is how to build new databases. In fact, if you think about the Abraham Maslow proverb, when the only tool you learn how to use is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So yes, everybody comes out of there and says, we need a new database because that's what we've taught them to do. IT professionals and leaders in particular get the idea that this skill is only needed when developing new databases, and that we really don't have a lot of need for data people if we're not developing new databases. So IT thinks data is a business problem. You know, their attitude is if they can connect to the server, my job is done, no problem. And the business thinks that IT is managing it. After all, there's a person over there with the title Chief Information Officer on their desk. Who else would be taking care of it? And as a result, data has fallen into a gigantic chasm between business and IT and received far too little attention over the last 3 decades around us. Our goal collectively has to be to repair that rift between the business and IT, and data is the glue that will help us get it to that particular area. But it's very difficult to do this because many organizations are stuck in what I call a bad data decision spiral. That is, that business decision makers and technology decision makers collectively are not data knowledgeable, and they make bad decisions, which results in poor treatment of organizational data assets and poor data quality, leading, of course, to poor organizational outcomes. And the question is, how do we break out of this particular cycle? Well, it's critically important when you're looking at something like this to realize that you need something concrete in order to help people out. So one of my favorites recently has been that I've gone to about, well, I haven't gone anywhere in the last year, but visited with about 12 different organizations in the last year who have mistakenly put in salesforce.com and then decided to clean the data up. Unfortunately, what happens there, that's a bad data decision, although they may not understand that. But what happens there is that people log on to the new salesforce.com system and go, oh, this data is not right, but they don't say the data is not right. They say Salesforce isn't right. And Salesforce gets the blame for something that really shouldn't be a part of that. As a result of all of this, organizations just have little idea what data that they have. They don't know where it is, and they don't know what their knowledge workers are doing with it. And that leads to a whole series of challenges. If we want quality data products, we don't have the ability to generate them randomly. Data management happens pretty well at the workgroup level. It is one of the defining characteristics of a workgroup. If you can exchange data, you're part of the workgroup. Without guidance, what are the chances, however, that all workgroups are pulling towards the same objective? Very little. More importantly, perhaps, consider the amount of time that your organizations are learning their practices on their own and individually. Data chaff becomes sand gumming up the works, preventing smooth interoperation and changes. We say death by 1,000 cuts. It's really death from many cuts, and they're unnecessary. It's death is a little bit much because, of course, most of your organizations are perfectly fine and dandy. So pain by lots of unnecessary cuts that have been difficult to account for. But if we start, we can actually get good at it. Organizations and individuals lack the knowledge, the skills. They really don't have the data management know-how, and the data strategy is the why of this. Let's dive a little bit further now. Again, when we talk about data management as a component, we can always go to Wikipedia and see that it has some things that we describe around this. It's a broad definition is what describes on there. Again, we've got our own definition in DAMA. Data resource management is the development, execution of architectures, policies, blah, blah, blah. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's good definition here, but we really do need to make things concrete for people in order to help them out. This is an ancient slide, but people have been misunderstanding data management forever. People think that, you know, if we just catalog and write down and come up with glossaries and all sorts of things, that will take care of it. Or this was actually from the Portland DAMA chapter. I don't know if anybody out there in Portland remembers who gave that to me, but we just label everything and it'll all be fine. Even Microsoft is really questionable whether they understand even today data management, but this is an old commercial that they had where they were mapping out data models. Looks kind of good, right? Of course, look where they're doing it. Yeah, that's not exactly putting us in the best light. I'm sure that's probably sexist and misogynistic as well, but it is part of history. Of course, it's not a statue. Anyway, in 2009, DAMA got together and added integration and interoperability as one of the 11 practice areas that we have comprising the DIMBOK. And the DIMBOK, remember, has only been created in 2009. We added this pie in 2017. We're talking recent history here. It's not that people are suddenly discovering this, it's that we're now starting to understand that there are things we can do that will be helpful. Let's talk about why. A data model focus is typically on some domain. There may be a software engineering effort that creates program A. A data modeling effort might describe the data that's being used by program B, or maybe even if we get good at it, we can have all of the things that are encompassed by the brown database that they're there. ERPs and commercial off-the-shelf software are marketed in the same way. Yes, everything that's brown will talk to program A, B, and C in this particular area. If we increase the scope of that to the entire thing, of course, it'll be much better. But where do we now get into the beyond the workgroup situation or beyond the capability of any one engineer or any one architect to understand this? And who takes care of the green and the orange? And more importantly, who makes sure that all of these are actually talking to each other as we look at these? When we look at broadly here, that data is a great focus of business value. All the unicorns that are out there are trying to get onto these things. And it's, again, up to that concept I presented earlier of the organizational data machine in order to do this. If we don't take that kind of a focus, we will not get the leverage on this. So again, organization-wide focus with a real development of shared understanding, but not just understanding of the current needs, understanding where we're headed as an organization. We want to make the data efficient and effective. We do that by leveraging it with combination of people, process, and technologies. And you can see already that if we reduce the amount of rot associated with that, it will actually be helpful. Let's, however, dive deeper into the data management activity. And this is one that we put out in 2007, where we were talking about the organization state of the practice and things like this. What we've discovered over the years is that data management is very much like the blind person's and the elephant. Somebody at their ears thinks it's a fan, somebody on the trunk takes it as a snake, somebody on the leg it's a tree, somebody's got the tail, it's a rope, and of course somebody at the side of the elephant, it's a wall, right? Well, they're all partly correct, and of course they're really missing the bigger picture. So we've tried to use a more broad definition of data management, saying that it's everything that happens between the sources and uses of data. And while that's a great description, it's really not very helpful, although I think it is encompassing in that. Let's take a look at one of the first key pieces that's missing, and that is that we already said, and I admonish you all to admonish anybody else who says that data is the new oil. No, not the way to think about it. Think about it in soil, and you'll immediately think to reusing that particular piece. That said, however, that's still not good enough. We have to really do acknowledge that data coming in as a series of sources and uses has a discrete series of things that happen to it. Most have been confirmed around data science because it's gotten lots and lots of buzz around it. But if you look back on data engineering, we've got very definitive activities that are specifically engineered and are developing into subdisciplines around this, as are the data exploitation pieces, of which data science is one of them. Data storytelling, data journalism, some wonderful careers that are out there. And again, even this more complex model still doesn't get the reuse. That's another whole piece that we have to add to this. If we don't design for reuse, it will be more difficult. And of course, reuse features heavily into interoperability. Again, you can see there's a variety of specialized skills, and we need to have a governance and ethical use framework that takes care of the entire process so that everything can be well understood. Right now, it's closer to the wild, wild west out there, which is unfortunately why you have to keep seeing people relearn this particular lesson over and over again. Bad data plus anything awesome is still bad results, or more simply, garbage in, garbage out. And this garbage in, garbage out leads to some really kind of tragic situations in here. I mean, I've seen people that have the perfect model, but of course, garbage data will not help. Neither will the perfect warehouse or the perfect machine learning algorithm, any form of BI, blockchain, AI, master data management, governance, analytics, any form of technology at all is dependent on good quality data in order to produce anything other than garbage results. One of the things that understanding your data flows and interoperability will do is identify specific areas where you're sending the same data twice to the same different business streams. Even those reductions in the amount of cycles that it takes. Again, I may have a query that literally goes 1 billion times a day, but if I can shave a millisecond or two off of that query, those milliseconds add up very, very quickly. Of course, we've got to get these populated with the good data, and then make sure that these produce the right results in order to transform our garbage results into quality results in there. Where does this leave us from a data challenge perspective? Well, data management is consumed with interoperability. We always assume that data sets are perfect, just as they are in classes when we teach them. But of course, we know that's not the case. And much happens to actually denigrate the processes, the quality of the data sets that are in there. We have not been teaching the skills required to undo the mess that we have left people with, and that's a huge, huge problem. Again, we go back to our DIMBOK on this. This is the first time that we've had guidance in this area, so it's okay to be new, but we definitely don't want to remain that way. Let's look a little bit now at data strategy around this. When I see organizations trying to do data strategy, it's very much analogous to trying to write the world's best pop song on the very first try. Again, pick whichever song that you like. It's not going to happen. Sometimes just people do get lucky, but in the most part, it's a very challenging exercise. And there's entirely too much focus on the document and its contents, and not enough focus on the processes that are required to execute strategy. So our theory of constraints cycle allows us to scope our data management challenges to something that will materially impact an interoperability challenge in a very significant way. And yet when we look at how people are doing strategy, I've seen all three of these being handed to me and said, this is our data strategy. It's like, well, that's great. And I appreciate it. They're good technologies and nothing wrong with them. But please show me how you're going to use data science, big data analytics in order to support the organizational strategy. And then I get some of these answers as well. As magical as AWS is, it's probably not going to be your data strategy in and of itself. In fact, when you look at it, most organizations say we've got an organizational strategy and then there's an IT strategy, and that's entirely reasonable. But what is wrong is to put the data strategy subordinate to the IT strategy. Play it, Morgan Freeman.
Wrong.
Thank you very much. I love the way he says that. This is wrong. So what should we do? Well, very simply, we need to reorient the way in which these are done. And notice that I've made the data strategy actually superior to the IT strategy. One of the main reasons for doing data management is that data is largely unmanaged in some organizations, and that can lead directly to dollar savings, in particular in the areas of IT strategy, where organizations simply can avoid buying things or investing in things that will not produce useful outcomes for them. Let's start off with a very basic definition of strategy. We haven't used the word a lot until around 1950, when the business literature writers glammed onto the term and said, if we call everything strategy, people will buy our books. So you'll see definitions that talk about things like a master plan or a game plan and things like that. I'm not going to claim a lot of knowledge around this, but it seems to me that that's a thing, right? The plan. And again, I think that the use in military context, is a little bit more refined. It's a pattern in a stream of decisions. And that is much less a thing and much more focused on attempting to achieve outcomes around this. What are we trying to get done with the strategy? Let's look at a couple of examples here. First of all, one that you'll probably all recognize. Walmart's business strategy for many years was everyday low price. And the reason that was important was huge for their culture. If you were on the Walmart Express out to the Bentonville airport, people were talking about everyday low price. Customers in their stores spoke about everyday low price. Everybody who worked with Walmart understood that this was the goal. And more importantly, Walmart walks the talk. If somebody makes a decision and it was supportive of business strategy, as in it's helped the organization keep up its promise of everyday low price, that was generally at worst considered a coachable moment, but people didn't get fired for making the wrong decisions there. So a very interesting organization. Again, notice, however, the beauty of everyday low price as a message, as a strategy, as a guide, as a pattern in a stream of decisions. Another different definition of strategy, Wayne Gretzky, those of you who are familiar with him and know how he described this, would say that he skates to where he thinks the puck will be. He knows that chasing a piece of plastic around on the ice that moves faster than people do is always going to be a game of catching up. So his definition of strategy is I'm going to be available for somebody to pass to me. And when they get passed to, I will score. And that is very successful. If you want to look a little further, his Wikipedia entry has conversations between Wayne and his father describing these talks. What a wonderful way to introduce the concept. Let's take one more example. This is a complex example. And the question here is, how do I defeat the competition when their forces are bigger than mine? The answer is divide and conquer. Again, remember our pattern in a stream of decisions. So let's take a look at Napoleon at Waterloo, which is where this example is derived from. Notice that I've circled in the upper right-hand corner the lines of supply. This is some supply line metadata that Napoleon used to plan this particular exercise. Remember, he's in the blue here in French, and his goal is to defeat the two larger armies of the British in the upper left hand on the red and the Prussian in the black on the right. And what Napoleon noticed was that the British army was supplied out of Ostend on the coast. You can see the little dotted line taking you there, and that the Prussians were supplied out of Liege. And his thought was, if I hit these folks in exactly the right place, they will fall apart, because when an army is attacked, it tends to fall back towards its food instead of away from its food. Now, I'm oversimplifying military strategy here, but you get the idea. It's absolutely what Napoleon was betting on. Again, the idea was first divide. So I'm going to hit them in exactly this spot very, very forcefully and try to get the two armies to back away from each other. Did that win him the battle? No, it did not, because the second part was then turn to the right, everybody, and conquer first the Prussians, and then conquer second the French troops. Now, imagine trying to do this as a soldier, not terribly educated in Napoleon's army, and following a three-part strategy during this battle. First, hit them very hard in a place that divides them, and then everybody turn to the right, so we defeat the Prussians, and then everybody turn to the left and defeat the British. As I said, this is presented as an example of outstanding strategy development in our war colleges in today's environment. However, the results were unsuccessful, maybe perhaps because it was a complex strategy. And let's go back to a 100-page strategy, which I have seen a couple of them. Anything that ends up on the shelf is, of course, going to be pretty much problematic no matter which way you use it. Again, our goal here is to identify a pattern in a stream of decisions. Well, another piece of this process from a strategic perspective, too, is to understand foundations. Now, this is literally where I am speaking to you all today from my little 20-acre spot out in Montpelier, Virginia. And this was building a foundation for the barn. The barn, of course, is part of the identity out here. We have a tiny little horse farm out here. And the bank gave us exactly this much money to build a foundation, and then said, stop. We will not give you any more money until you prove to us that you have received a certificate of foundation approval from the County of Hanover in this case. So before further construction can proceed, they needed to make sure I had a good foundation. If I built a good barn on a poor foundation, anybody who lives in Hanover knows that the vet bills will always get paid before you pay the bank back on this. So it's actually just good business practice all the way around this. And yet there is no equivalent concept in IT, and this is hugely problematic. Primarily, again, I mentioned Maslow before because of Maslow's hierarchy. Now, if you understand the process here, it's that if you have food, clothing, and shelter needs that are unmet, physiological needs that are unmet, then you will not be safe. If you are never safe, then you will never belong to something that is larger than yourself. If you don't understand yourself as a part of everything else, these are architecture constructs after all, right? You will never reach the self-esteem level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you do not have self-esteem, you can never get to self-actualization. Many TED Talks now have ripped this concept off and call it flow. And why am I telling you this? Well, data practices are an awful lot like that. There's much, much, much investment in what I call data management technologies. And yet when we look over time, organizations consistently tell us that between 80 and 90% of their problems are people and process problems. They are foundational practices, that these technologies only scratch the surface of what we're actually trying to get to. And that understanding and putting in place these foundational practices will make those things easier, but most organizations do it exactly the opposite way around. Kind of like going to the top of Maslow's hierarchy and starting there by saying, I'm going to start by self-actualizing. It doesn't work. At the bottom half of this pyramid, of course, are capabilities, and that's what we really need to build in. And yet, in spite of this and this slide appearing on the walls of countless offices around the world, I still get calls that say, Peter, can you do this for me faster? And I say, yes, if we do it faster, it will take longer. If we do it faster, it will cost more. If we do it faster, it will deliver less. And if we do it faster, it will present greater risk to the organization. Again, thanks to Tom DeMarco for a wonderful set of inspirational quotes that led to this. These capabilities need to be done first. And from a strategy, that's really part of what we need to do. When we look at data management strategy, one of the things we'll see is that this is part of these integrated practice areas in here where we're just trying to manage data coherently. Now, 2/3 of all data management practices are managed only at the department level, not at the enterprise level just yet. That's something we're working on. It also says that you should set your sights in some place that is very reasonable on this. Of course, different departments can be of different sizes, et cetera, but that's objective data that we have over multiple years around that. In addition to making sure that everybody's moving in the same same direction, all work groups are doing the same types of general patterns in the stream of decisions. We also have now a class of data government professionals that we can employ in this area. 20 years ago, we did not, but we have done a great job of making this a great career field with well-defined characteristics on it. We're getting better at understanding life cycle management. We're understanding quality still is a relative term, a fit for purpose, and that we need to do this with consistent architecture and stacks in place. And yet, the weak link in the chain architecture that we talk about here is really problematic because we have a scale that we rate these things on. You get 1 point for an initial process, 2 points if what you do is managed, 3 points if it has some definition around it, 4 points if you're measuring, and 5 points if you use those measurements to improve the overall sub area that you're working within. So I'm going to very quickly grade each of these around the area of just coming up with 3s on all of them, which means they're defined. By the way, these are relatively high levels of practice areas in these. And each of these areas can be improved in subdomains as well. There's an entire method around here. If you Google CMMI Institute or my colleague Melanie Mecca, you will find lots of good information that describes this. However, if the grade of the data management strategy area is only 1, then unfortunately, because of the weak link in the chain architecture here, the entire process is only at a 1 level of strength. What that means literally is that I could put $1 billion into data quality and the organization would still not perform better, because without a data management strategy, it's likely that you will try to clean not just the 20% of your data that is not rot, but also the 80% of your data that is rot. And that, of course, as you can tell, is very much more complex. Similarly, your data governance organizations need to understand specifically that they cannot solve all of the organization's problems, and that they should look at these problems in context so that they understand what they're doing is useful. Now, I'm excluding all regulatory pieces. If the government says you have to do it, then of course you must do it in this way. But without a strategy, are we just going to start at the A's and work our way through? No, we're going to do things that help the organization tie improvements in data to improvements in organizational performance. And that is one of the primary goals of data governance. When we look at this from a platform and architecture perspective, one of the things that we see over and over again in organizations is a lot of shadow IT. In general, all organizations are going to have some amount of shadow IT. This is IT that is not in the mainframe. It's the executive who thinks they're pretty clever with data and may in fact be very clever with data. I've seen brilliant people do this. Go out and rent out of their budget a very small amount of Amazon Web Services stuff, hire their own data scientist and start working on their own data. The key, of course, comes back to interoperability. Oh, person who went off and did the shadow thing, that's brilliant. I need to use that now in a very specific way over here. Can you get this integrated to me by tomorrow night so that I can send out a mass mailer or recalibrate the ad server key pieces or whatever else it is that we're trying to do? And if there was not thought given to this process in the first place, the chances that we will just happen to work are slim to none. All of these areas that we've talked about so far are critical. Data quality is another aspect. One of the most important aspects of data quality is not the actual value of the individual data items, but what is the structure of the data items. If the data is structured in a manner that is less useful, you will convert it. In fact, we know that 20 to 40% of all IT costs are in some form a combination of managing, munging, and maneuvering the data around, evolving it over time, et cetera, et cetera. That's a lot. There are good savings that can be found in those areas by focusing on this as a core area of interoperability. I would rather, in most cases with the clients that I work with, see them put money into a center of excellence in interoperability than I would at this point seeing a center of excellence around something esoteric like data science around this. I don't mean that data science is esoteric. It's just that it's much easier to see a return on investment in these areas, whereas we know that most things data scientists try can't succeed. Otherwise, it would be very easy and everybody would do it. Finally, this last piece is the data operations piece. And in all of the areas of data operations, interoperability is something that happens or doesn't happen well, but I guarantee you that it happens. Our colleague Tom Redman likes to call these the hidden data factory problem. And it's the idea that we receive data from another department, another division, an external partner, and the first thing we do is we check it to make sure that it's correct. Sometimes it is, oftentimes it isn't, and we have developed in our organizations multiple redundant hidden data factories to fix problems that should be fixed at the source instead of at the problem. If I'm only sharing with 3 people, that's still 3 more people that should have to that are cleaning the data then should have to clean the data around that. Interoperability guides data operations. Interoperability is a measure that you can use to see how long, how much, and what types of costs need to occur. Another important characteristic here in operations is in fact starting to put costs on these things. I had somebody tell me the other day, well, I spend 25% of my time as a project lead dealing with bad data issues. And that's not that just the data was bad, but the data was in the wrong form. It didn't work for one reason or another. That's a very expensive resource. And if I was paying somebody to lead a project and found they were spending 25% of their time dealing with bad data, I would be very concerned that that individual might be looking for another job so that they didn't have to do the things they didn't really like to do, or perhaps were not comfortable doing or trained or anything, and putting time towards what they want. In fact, we know this is true because any data scientist will always tell you that they spend 80% of their time munging the data and 20% of their time actually figuring out something new and cool to do with it. If I take them down from 80% unproductive time to 60% unproductive time, that represents a doubling of those individuals' productivity. This is why interoperability is so critical. The best way to improve the performance of a data science group is to add a data engineer at a ratio of about 1 to 10. seems to be a good number in there. I may get some questions on that a little bit later on. Let's move on now into the theory of constraints. This is really the essence of data strategy, and it comes from a book that you may or may not be familiar with, but oftentimes are forced to read. Again, 6 million copies in print. Elihu Goldratt, I wish I had your royalties, right? He did a great job of this. Our hero here, I almost said Seth Rogen, it's Alex Rogen, is in charge of a company called Unico, and he's about to be shut down. He goes through a series of adventures around it. It's a wonderful read just for starters, but in addition to being a wonderful read, there's also a cool little movie and a very nice little audiobook that you can read on these as well. Highly recommend it. It will open your eyes to the idea of the weak link in the chain method of diagnosing organizational challenges. And we're going to apply them strictly to data challenges, but of course they're applicable in many, many ways. And if you know anything about the theory of constraints, you know it is intuitively data-based and inherently data-based at the same time. For example, just looking at this sort of silly comic here, you can see that the person at workstation 10 is having some sort of a challenge that is causing work to pile up and become confused. More importantly, the stations 14 and 18 are not getting any customers, all they are idle resources. This again is not a happy situation, and yet we have this occur in the data world all the time. Although most often it is not necessarily that there is a blockage, like you're having a heart attack or a blocked artery or something, but instead that there's a lot of little things. Again, goes back to Tom's concept of the hidden data factories in this area. Well, when you abstract this up to a larger context, the goal is all about understanding any system, and your data is a system, and the system is limited in achieving goals by a small number of constraints. Just the same way as most very complex analyses really do come down to a few key variables. Turns out that's the way it works in the world. Again, another application of Pareto principle, if you want to think about it in those terms. That means there's always one constraint. And the focus of the theory of constraints is to identify it, restructure the rest of the organization to address it. Again, you can see the chain is no stronger than its weakest link. These processes are vulnerable because the weak component can damage or adversely affect what is going on in each of these areas. And when we look at what's happening in those areas, what we see is that the organization is having some types of challenges around where they need to go. But we've got to do a good job with the analysis. So the theory of constraints is to identify the constraint. What is it that's currently keeping our organization's data from most directly supporting the organizational achievement of the organization's strategy? Again, I'll say that again. Data strategy is geared to supporting the organizational strategy and what can be done to improve that process. A step is to make quick improvements by seeing if you can fix it using existing resources. If you cannot, then you need to realign and subordinate other activities. In other words, maybe not implement all of those projects that we thought we were going to do this year because we haven't gotten this one right just yet. Elevate that constraint to another idea. Again, restructure around that so that we can do it. And if that doesn't work, repeat the process until we do that. The same thing then works out from a data improvements perspective. What is the thing that is causing the least interoperable? Where am I spending money? You may have to survey people and find out what types of activities they are running into that are not working well for them. Again, employee suggestion boxes, et cetera, all of these old techniques become very, very valuable in this type of analysis. Again, try to fix it without the restructuring, correct it from an operational perspective. If not, then we do need to restructure things. And this is where your data program needs to make sure that it has the kind of clout that it needs to be able to say, I'm sorry, we really shouldn't put in salesforce.com until we've cleaned the data. Or at least if we do put it in there, let's not turn it on and show it to everybody else. Let's make sure that we only show them good quality data. Again, if that doesn't work, then you may need to change some things in the organization in order to improve it. By going through these activities, you can now start to improve both the speed which you do this and the quality with which you do this. Again, the first effort's not going to be great, just like writing your first pop song isn't going to be great. But if you practice this process, your outputs will become better over time. And that is absolutely critical to do this. Of course, if you read the shampoo bottle, you never actually break out of the loop. We do want to break out of the loop here somewhere so that we can come back and take a look at how all of these things are coming out. When we look at it, I've said it a couple of times, I'm going to just make it explicit. The organization's data strategy exists specifically to support the better use of data to help the organization achieve its strategy. There is no other way around it. If you're doing anything other than that, the boss has a good basis for saying what is going on and why are you doing this. When we look at data strategy is really focusing here on data management and saying there's a lot of things that need to be done. What are the things that if we do them sooner will help the organization achieve its strategy faster or better, again, or cheaper? Again, it's always going to come down to one of those three components. And the idea going back is how well is the data supporting the strategy? These ought to be explicit conversations held by executives around the table with their data leadership as well. Some organizations call it a chief data officer. Other organizations are still reticent and do things like enterprise data executive or top data job. Of course, if we look at how this happens, again, in Peter's world at least, data management can help inform what types of IT projects need to be done and oftentimes do not need to be done because we do data better. Recall that most of the definitions of systems are something goes in, something happens, and something goes out. And consequently, if we do it in that fashion, we may be able to find a way that we don't need to actually have it transformed by a system, that we can do that transformation with a database or some other type of technology, XML style sheets, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we'll put our feedback loops in there just to make sure that we pull all of the loop together. It's a pretty complex picture, but I think that you get the idea of where that needs to go. So let's talk a little bit before we get to the Q&A. This discipline of data interoperability has not had 8,000 years of generally accepted accounting principles to be developed around it. Again, 8,000 years is a long time. We know that GAAP has been around in some form for a long time because we have accounting records that were done in hieroglyphics that we found at the base of the pyramids. This is a long time to mature. We have not had that amount of time to mature, and consequently, it does become a challenge for us. Second, your data's a mess. I can't tell you how few organizations that I come to, and they don't say to me, well, we really don't want to show this to you because it doesn't look really great. I say, don't worry, I'm not going to mention your name on the air and call you out in front of all of your colleagues and things like that. But yes, it's very likely that your data is a mess. 1 in 10 organizations out there is attempting to do better with data. So if you are attempting to do this, you've already got a lot of lift behind your efforts. And 1 in 10 of those are actually succeeding on an enterprise level. That's not a really good set of numbers. On the other hand, it means that your organizational opportunity is very good because you will literally enter a small select circle of organizations that do a really good job with respect to their data management and their data strategy, and consequently have a positive impact on the way in which they interoperate as an organization. Your folks don't really know how to use or improve your data assets effectively. And I don't mean to pick on specific people. I've met thousands of data professionals over the years at various events, but you all come to that event because you care about it. For every one of us that is at these conferences, there are hundreds of others that are just discovering this on a level that is really wonderful and touching. One of the things we all miss so much about meeting in person is that you would get the newbie that would come to this and go, oh my goodness, I found my peeps. What on earth, where have you been all my life? I know that sounds really weird, but there is absolutely crazy amounts of not awareness in these areas. You likely require a new business data program. That is to say, something that needs to be made equivalent in management's mind to HR. After all, nobody says, oh, I think everybody will behave from this point on out. We're not going to hire anybody. We don't have any training needs. So let's lay off the HR group. Of course, they may rise and shrink depending on the organization and the environment's situation, but nobody thinks we're not going to need them anymore. And yet we have this other crazy class of business assets that we know currently incurs a lot of data debt. And in order to improve that asset, we are going to need a program just the same way as we have an HR program. Very key that this be housed in the business, because the IT shop is focused on different priorities and, more importantly, a different way of implementing those priorities. IT is largely a project-based discipline. Nothing wrong with that. But trying to do these two out of the same organization has been a recipe for disaster in many organizations. If you want to see that, come back and talk to me offline, and I'll be glad to tell you stories for a virtual beer. Data strategy and data management are major data program components. They need to work together, and they need to be doing three things in particular, and they need to be doing them in at least somewhat this order. There needs to be focus on improving the organizational data. If we don't improve the data, we will have good people using bad data to make decisions. And we've already seen that bad data plus anything awesome still leads to bad results. We also, however, need to improve the way people use data. Even our data scientists are not trained to be data mungers. When they are faced with a data interoperability challenge in their initiatives, their efforts, many of them have skills, but the vast majority have never had skills in these areas, because the textbooks always present them with reasonably good quality data. Only after you've improved your organizational data and the way your people use the data, by improving it at a level that involves what we call knowledge worker level data literacy. That all knowledge workers, because they all deal with data, should have a baseline level of data literacy in order to do this. Only after you've done those two things can you then improve how people use data to better support strategy. Because if they don't understand the context here, there's no hope that they will be able to do the kinds of things that we want them to be able to do on this. This can only be accomplished incrementally using an iterative approach focused on one aspect at a time and applying formal translations in order to get that to run. Many organizations have trouble getting these initiatives off the ground, but you can in fact do it in a way that shows an interoperability is where the value is. If you say, I integrated the A data with the B data, and somebody says, okay, that's nice, do you get a pat on the head or what? But if you say, hey, I came down the hall and I had chocolate and somebody else had peanut butter, and we managed to get the two of those things to interoperate, by golly, that is something that people can get excited about, because I can sell those things to the tune of $1 billion or several billion a year. We get real excited about data things happening in the data world. We've also got to get very excited about taking the data things that happen and translating them for our users so that they understand that these data things mean that these business things happen, and that those business things are driven by value. And by using value, we can actually come back and achieve what we are attempting to do by pulling together all of the rest of this. Now, this leads us to a couple more topics that we're going to deal with in the next month or so. Again, architecture and modeling. If we have a common understanding of the two of those, what we're really talking about is how data modeling efforts interoperate to create an organizational data architecture. Then the next month, we will dive into why data modeling is so specifically fundamental on this. And then finally, we'll take a look at how to create some business value just starting with reference and master data strategies. So that will take us across the summer for these things. I hope that you all are able to join us for some of these things. They're all at the same bat time, same bat place. And again, recall that I've got some book specials that are running right now. So we're almost at the top of the hour, and I will turn it back over to Shannon and look forward to your questions on this.
Peter, thank you so much as always for a great presentation. Thanks to all of our attendees. And again, thank you for joining in our new platform very last minute. Love that you're here and participating. If you have questions for Peter, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section of your screen. There's a Q&A panel in the bottom middle that you can open up. One of the new features that I don't know if you've ever played with before in Zoom that I've enabled is you can kind of give a thumbs up on different questions if you don't have to type it out. So if you see a question that somebody's asked and it say, hey, that's my same question, you can click on the thumbs up so that we can see that multiple people have the exact same question. If you hate that, or if you hate any other feature, how we've set things up, feel free to let me know, because we want to fine tune this and make it work for you more than anybody else.
One of the things that Shannon is so good at is to be able to actually improve these programs. I've mentioned several times, this is our 10th year of working together on these. And each time, while we have sort of some similar topics, she guides the translation of each of these programs in a way that is responsive to the types of questions that you all have been asking. So as she says, thank you all for being such an involved and engaged audience on here. There's just so many exciting things going on around here, and the more we can share this knowledge, the better off we will all be.
I love it. Thank you, Peter, so much for that. And then so diving in here, just to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and the recording and anything else. And I see lots of thumbs up. Oh, I'm so excited. Okay. Peter, could you share some light on the approach terms of getting buy-in on interoperability across shared functions, risk, compliance, or business lines, revenue generating, say retail, corporate, business, marketing?
I wouldn't focus on interoperability, and the reason for that, as language, that's certainly the goal. Imagine yourself in an elevator speech, and this is something that we teach all the students, where you get on the elevator at the 20th floor, and somebody looks over at your badge and says, "Oh, Peter, you work for me, and you do this thing called data. Tell me, what is it that you do about data, and why should I care about data interoperability?" And if I was able to say, well, ma'am, that data interoperability or the lack thereof it, we know is costing this organization $4.5 million a year, I will get a second question, I guarantee you. $4.5 million a year, what are you talking about? How could that possibly be the case? Well, yes, we've calculated this. And by the way, that is a minimum number, not a maximum number. But if I was to say, yes, ma'am, I'm focused on interoperability, she would peg me for what I instantly and clearly am, an academic egghead of no use to that particular organization or that particular business executive's problems. So now, if we can't talk about interoperability, what can we talk about? And Shannon, if you'll read the question there, I heard the word risk. I heard the word monetizing, I think.
Yes, risk, compliance across shared risk and compliance, finance, or business lines, revenue generating, say retail, corporate, business, marketing.
Super. And those are the things that you want to translate into the things that mean things to the executive. So, for example, I've worked with organizations that had trouble where they were doing compliance related activities, but they were doing them badly, and they were receiving fines from various regulatory organizations for not complying with things that they said they were doing. Even though they were doing them, they were just reporting badly, and that was what was resulting in the fine. So no change required in the business on this, other than changing a little business practice to make sure that the reporting was filed on time, and we were avoiding X number of tens of thousands of dollars a year in fines on that particular piece. I would not try to sell that as an interoperability piece, but absolutely realize that that's exactly what's going on there, that when we hand this data off to this group, there's only one person that knows how to take it out of an Excel .xls file and transform it into the XML reporting requirements that we are required to use by the government reporting agency, and that only happens once a month. And if that person misses a month, again, I'm making a story up here on the spot, but hopefully this makes sense. Use the risk components, use the lack of compliance, use the monetization pieces. I gave an example in the middle of the presentation of a colleague who is a very hardworking colleague, but who literally spends 25% of their time dealing with data interoperability issues. I would be unhappy at that level. That would make me dissatisfied with that particular situation. I would want to do things to improve it, because after all, we all want the organization, whether it's the university or whatever other organization we're working for, to have some very good practices around that. I went on long enough, Shannon. I think I got the point across. Thank you for the great question.
Indeed. So I know you're going to love this next question, Peter. What are the recommended certifications for somebody who's starting in data management?
There's a number of them out there. Obviously, as president of the DAMA, I would be derelict if I didn't mention my own. I say my own, it's not mine. It's one I've been associated with for literally 20 years. And I think we have done a very credible job of keeping that certificate relevant and desired. I can remember one of my favorite days in the world occurred about 2 years ago, where I got a communication from somebody inside the intelligence community that said, we'd like to hire some people who have had the certificate for 30 years. And we had to write back and say, I'm sorry that there's nobody that's had the certificate for 30 years. It has not been around for that long out there. There are several others out there. All are worth investigating, and certainly would be worthwhile. Happy to answer any specific questions offline on that.
Yeah, and more universities are offering some degrees and certifications as well, which is exciting.
Not as many as we'd like, but that's a different topic, Shannon. I'll rant on that one for a bit. Absolutely.
We're working on it. All right. So Peter, love the deck. And we'll send out a PDF of the deck to all the registrants, but would you allow attendees to reuse some of the slides for internal presentations?
Yeah, and I always say that because our goal is to help the community here. And if it helps you all to scarf something from one of these things, yeah, that's great. If you give us a little credit on there, that's perfectly fine. But by all means, do not invent the wheel again. As I mentioned before, the iceberg diagram in particular, I have seen on more cubicles than Dilbert's recently. And that could be because Dilbert turned out to be not a very pleasant person to work with. We won't go there. We had to kind of exercise him. We got canceled. I don't know exactly what was the deal there. That's something else that happened. But yeah, there's definitely some areas around that we can help. It's just not well known. And if some of these are help, by the way, I should point out too, many of these were contributed by your colleagues in the profession here. I'm certainly not the first person who said that data is the iceberg and all the rest of that, although I did lose train of where that one came from on this. But yes, I think we all do. And if these things are helpful to you, let us know, drop a line. But more importantly, help us by improving. If you come up with something that's useful, by all means, suggest it in. There's probably a local DAMA chapter near you that would be interested in you chatting a little bit. Shannon, are you doing the lightning speeches this time as you go forward?
No, I'm not.
A little harder over Zoom, right? Even though it is Zoom. When we can finally get back together, one of the funnest things about one of the conferences that Shannon does is a lightning speech, which is a 5-minute pitch of trying to make something happen. And it usually happens about the time the alcohol comes out as well. We all have a wonderful time, and it's great practice. And we've seen and learned tons and tons of things from seeing this.
It's true. It's a lot of fun. And thank you, Peter. I knew I didn't hesitate to ask you that live and put you on the spot because I knew that you, I know your feelings on that. And that's so fantastic. Thank you. Not sure if this is an appropriate question with regard to today's session, but any thoughts on missteps made with regard to assessing data and systems in the M&A process, due diligence, and considering defined post-acquisition period?
Wow. I don't think you've heard this story, Shannon. I thought I was super smart back about 20 years ago because I, with a couple of colleagues, codified the technique called data reverse engineering. And in an M&A world, M&A is very, very simple. It's mergers and acquisitions. in this area. And the mergers and acquisitions theory is very simple. I have 1 million customers and you have 1 million customers. We both have systems. We'll put them together. With one set of systems, we can service 2 million customers, and that way we'll be able to provide better service to the customers and make more money as well. What a great idea. What could possibly go wrong with this? Well, of course, many of you know that some mergers and acquisitions have been very successful and some of them have been absolutely disastrous. But Peter thought he was real smart. So I went up to Wall Street and spoke to some of the people in the M&A world and said, look, guys, I can tell you in advance what sort of problems you're going to run into at the interoperability level. Because if you are planning to take systems from company one and put them with systems of company two, there needs to be interoperability between the two of them. And I got shown the door so fast each and every time. They said the only information you could possibly give us might cause somebody to doubt the deal. We want the deal to go through. So I think probably, although I would love to work with an M&A group and help show these techniques, because I think there's a tremendous amount of value there, I think that more value is going to come when we really look at the private equity market. Because when you can come into an organization, I have a friend who's done this. I love the way he says it. They go around the room and introduce themselves. And so who are you and why are you here, right? My friend says, I represent ownership. And that's all he has to say to make sure that everybody else understands that these things will be done, because that situation is the one that will most easily benefit from this. They've acquired the companies specifically for the purpose of looking for low-hanging fruit in terms of the integration or synergistic combinations, to use an overused word in that area. And again, I'm super surprised that I haven't had more success helping organizations with this, because it just seems to me to be a no-brainer, but I'm probably not very good at marketing this stuff. So come back on that. But I'd love to chat with you further in the M&A world, because I think there was a very big missed opportunity around that. Although I did understand their bit about wanting the transaction to go through, because if I caused any fear, doubt, or uncertainty around the transaction, they would just run away and go do something else instead of doing the things that they were gearing towards doing. Great question. Thank you.
Love it. So what would you recommend to make organization and people not jump on analytics and technology overuse, instead of figure out the foundational stuff first, like data strategy or data management strategy?
Thank you for a really interesting question. Yeah, it's not so much that I'm advocating one versus the other. In fact, I teach an online MBA course where literally the class is dropped into the middle of an Amazon Web Services scenario and told to figure something out pretty quick. None of them have any prior background in that, but they learn from a bunch of YouTube videos and online manuals, and pretty soon at the end of a 7-week period come back and go, wow, this stuff is not rocket science in order to do this. That said, the idea that technology as a starting place to do this, it's been perpetuated by all of our educational programs. On my desk right now is a book that we use in that course that I was just describing. And the first couple chapters are all about statistics. There's nothing in the book about having to share SPICE data set resources so that the entire class can gain access to it, or to create a shared data structure that they can use to use. Now, by the way, I am talking technology, but the things I'm talking technology are people and process issues. The hardest thing to do is to get a group of MBAs who've been all taught that they're brilliant, and they are, to work together as a group, because they won't get full credit for any of their work if they're not helping out their fellow group member. One more point on this, Shannon. Randy Beam, who's been a friend for years, has run a survey at newventuresurvey.com, newventurepartners.com, and I'll attach that to this piece. This is the 2021 version of their survey. So we'll attach it to the end of the PDF file that Shannon will be sending you guys. And they've asked the same question for the last 4 years. What are the problems that you're having in becoming more data-driven, becoming more utility and analytics, et cetera, et cetera? And the answers resoundingly vary between 92 and 80%. In other words, 4 out of 5 challenges in the data area are people and process challenges and are not technology challenges. But when we look at what we teach the students and the aspiring people who love this discipline and want to get into it, and teach them only about technology, they miss out on the idea. I'll tell one wonderful story. I heard this as a keynote address, I think it was from Data World, and I forget the individual who related, but certainly I think it's out there and you guys could Google it. Went running into a boss and said, "Hey, I managed to get an 86% correlation on something." I was not prepared for the response, which was that the boss turned red and smoke was coming out of the ears. And we don't do anything in our organization that is less than 100% was the response. Now get back there and fix that. So again, just a miscommunication there, but clearly the organization could benefit in this case from becoming more literate around the data pieces, much less around the technology pieces. So again, too much emphasis on technology, both from the university perspective, but also in terms of other types of offerings that are out there. We need more work around the people and process offerings. That is what's really going to help us make progress in this field. In case you couldn't tell, Shannon, I have a high horse on that one.
Oh, wait. That's great. Can you share some insights on creating identifier crosswalks to improve interoperability?
It's a great question. It's an approach to creating alternate key structures. And let me describe to you a project that I was personally involved with. And that was the idea that during the opioid crisis, the federal government discovered that we had about 17 different primary keys, ways of uniquely identifying an individual physician who is capable of prescribing opioids. 17 different ways. There was one for the DEA, there was one for Customs and Border Patrol. Again, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of these things out there. And the government made an effort to go to one type of ID. And it's a wonderful case study. I don't have any information on it, but I'm sure if you Google it, you'll be able to find some things that relate to that. It was exactly that process. It was to say that we're not going to replace the system that Customs and Border Patrol or any of these other systems use, but we can augment them by putting in additional identification information that is unique to that individual, and then using them as the question you described to go across various systems and discover this. A really good place to find out where this is happening is in the dark web, because that's where people get things like, oh, the Ashley Madison data set and the Office of Personnel Management data set, and merge them with the target data set, trying to find that one individual who perhaps through drunk web crawling decided to register at ashleymadison.com using their whitehouse.gov. Yes, there were 44 of them that did that. Whitehouse.gov email address, who then is discovered to be perhaps having bad habits that they've developed that they're able to infer by stealing these target data that describes them as a customer. Again, yeah, these are problems, and the people who are doing it well are the bad guys, and we need to put some more work around the other direction on that.
Thank you, Peter. And so do a lot of corporations combine data strategy with data and analytics strategy?
Do a lot? Yes. I see an awful lot that are trying to do this. The essence, though, of what you're trying to do from an analytics perspective benefits well from this same theory of constraints that I've outlined in this talk. Think about it. What you're really trying to do is to identify, uncover a new pattern, some sort of novel way of combining assets that you have or can get very easily to achieve some specific outcome. And when you do that, you will actually have more failures than success. So one of the things you have to learn to do is to fail very quickly, but also do so in a way that's quite objective in the nature of that. Again, most organizations don't teach that. I hate to say this, it's kind of like the process of trying to find a spouse. You literally are going to fail every time until you finally get to the right person, and you may even fail sometimes on the way there. I know I certainly did, but I'm totally happy where I'm at right at the moment. And I say that because my spouse is sitting right across the table from me and will throw something at me if I... There we go. Anyway, a little too much information there, right, Shannon?
That's good. It's personal. I love it. So diving in here, beyond the methodological part, I can say that 10 times fast, that
Absolutely.
probably implies, is there any recommended tool that can take over or support this topic?
Yeah. The technology that I found that seems to be most useful for organizations, and I've already mentioned this one, is to start out by developing a core set of competencies around data and data engineering, data munging types of activities. I'd rather have people who were competent in that for a start than I would have people who are competent in Tableau, for example, or visualization in general. Not that there's anything wrong with the other, but if I don't put the right stuff in, all the Tableau stuff in the world is going to be very pretty, but not actually very useful around that. So absolutely, by all means, take a look at what is happening when your data is being used by the organization, and look for specialization that you can say, kind of like a fire building, firehouse mentality. So some of the time they're going to be out fighting fires and doing things to fix things. And by the way, when they do, make sure that they total up the damage and the costs and all the rest of the things, because that's going to be important for the organization. They, as a central place, are also going to be in receipt of a better bird's eye view of the entire organization around that. But then, start working on how the organization actually uses that data. And if you evolve those together, I think you'll find a much more satisfactory approach than just trying just the far end, because many times you will also discover you're the victim of garbage in, garbage out. And there's nothing that Tableau can do with that other than embarrass you.
So data debit or data debt?
Data debt.
All right.
Sure. I might have spelled it wrong though. I'll have to look that up. Wouldn't be the first time.
All right. So what are your views on modern hybrid data landscape versus different systems presenting data challenges of 90s and 2000s? Can you comment on the below line of thought and frustration and the difference in today's hybrid data landscape in terms of storage and computer latency? Yeah.
We are learning a couple things. One of them is that nobody ever saved money by going to the cloud. That's not to say the cloud is not something that we should absolutely exploit as appropriate, but the cloud also marks a very good demarcation point. I have 3 rules for data in the cloud. 1, it should be of less volume. 2, it should be cleaner, and 3, it should be more shareable. Imagine if the opposite were the case. We're going to put data in the cloud that is less shareable than data outside the cloud. We're going to put data in the cloud that is less clean than data outside the cloud. These are nonsense. So from that perspective, I think that there's a lot of things that can be done, but it does represent a transition. And as the questioner asked, it's a hybrid environment. We've seen lots of organizations, we're going to move everything to the cloud, right? Well, it's just going to take one little $15 an hour cloud worker who's mad at the world this day and put their USB device into the port. And in spite of all the things that we've put in place to make sure this doesn't happen, guarantee it'll continue to happen in this. I'm not saying that we're going to have a retrenchment from this, but I do think a couple of disasters from now we'll be talking a different tune about the value of actually having both types of environments so that we can shift back and forth. It reminds me of the first mainframe computer system that I ran into way back in the late 1970s, where the organization was quite proud of the fact that they had 2 IBM 360s that they ran as twins, but if one of the machines failed, they had a process by which it would automatically cut over to the other one, just like starting your generator outside. Only this other one was also carrying a load at the time. It was quite an ingenious way of doing it. IBM was really elegant engineering around all of that. The idea is that we will be with these mixed environments for a while. And until we come up with either foolproof security, I think we're going to see things just like we saw in the systems architecture area of a swing between centralized and decentralized. Anybody remember when we had the zero width client on one side of things, and all we were going to need were Chromebooks and things like that, and we could sign everything because it'll run on a fast server from the web? Well, we've gone full circle in many ways and discovered, I think correctly, that there are many architectures and some are suitable for some applications and some are suitable for other applications. All of these are important, and it's also important for us to continue to be able to work in these environments. I hate to say that it's no simple answer, but I think that's the one we're going to have to be stuck with. By the way, my definition of legacy is anything that's in production.
Perfect. So we've got some time for a few more questions here. We got some great questions coming in. I love it, you guys. In your experience, do you think the thing is time to include a new knowledge area to the DEMA wheel as interoperability was included in the last version?
It's difficult to include a new area in, not that it should be impossible or difficult, but just that so much has been built on the existing things, kind of like somebody builds a database and writes a bunch of programs that go around it. I do not have any idea of what else could be included, but I guarantee you that the process we're setting up to improve the next version of this will be absolutely looking for people that want to suggest these things. So if you've got ideas about it already, let me know. We'll put you on a list, and in reward for your speaking up, we'll try to include you in that process and perhaps give you some responsibilities around that as well, because it's a big job in order to pull all this together.
Indeed, it is. Perfect. And as businesses adapt the new data-driven frameworks, what risks do you see to businesses that don't?
Now, let's first of all talk about what is an objective definition of data-driven. I have not found a good one. I've tried to write one once, in the data strategy book. Chapter 6 addresses specifically what it means, the 4 concrete behaviors, very much along the lines of the Agile Manifesto, which, remember, didn't actually say this is good and that's bad. What they said is, we value everything that's on this list, but we value the things that are on the left-hand side of this list more than we value the things on the right-hand side of this list, which, by the way, is a pattern and a stream of decisions or a strategy. And so data-driven to me seems to be a bunch of words: data first, data-centric, gosh, all sorts of things. I'm struggling with how to make these things concrete so that people can look and say objectively, am I doing something that is data driven or am I not? These are non-trivial questions and we don't have easy answers for them. But I would say, back to the previous question, we are working on a lot of them and welcome your input into these activities.
Indeed. So I'm going to just check the time here. Good data management strategy. How could it start from the microservices storage layer? Or would it be about only raw data that is collected from that variety of sources?
I think both of those are grounded in the data. I would start off by looking at the organization and saying, what does the organization need from you as a data leader to achieve better its organizational strategy? Another start runs the risk of focusing largely on a technology component as opposed to a business component. And we've got to get better in our roles as professional data people of celebrating not just the good data things that happen, but when a good data thing happens, to actually take it to, and by the way, that results in a business thing that has happened, a happy outcome around that. It's just a matter of practicing, and the more we all collectively practice at it, the better we'll be able to do.
I think we got time for one more quick question here, Peter. So could you please share light on the operating model supporting data management for a business area within an organization, for example, security? What level of data management skills should we target for subject expertise in such a business area?
Well, I don't know, the security is a word that you picked on anyway, but one of the challenges that we have in our profession and also at the C-level suite is understanding that you cannot secure your data if you can't manage it. And so data management is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to data security. And I'll just leave it at that, because that's fundamental enough that it actually causes a lot of organizations to go back and rethink some previous lightweight thinking around those areas.
So this has been great, Peter. I'm going to end it there just because I do want to take an extra minute here just to say thank you again so much, everybody, for jumping on board in this very quick turnaround in webinar platforms. Peter, thank you so much for being our guinea pig and just jumping right in without
Now you tell me I'm the guinea pig. Okay, Shannon. That's yeah. And thank you, Shannon, for being so calm, cool, and collected through the crisis that I know you went through in the last 24 hours here. So hopefully your life will be easier from this point on out.
I hope so. I hope we can get a lot of people into the Zoom and using Zoom, and really appreciate it. And again, if y'all think that there is something that you like and how we set things up or don't like, please let me know. We'll continue to refine this and set this up so that it's really useful and effective for you. Because so I won't, if you say I don't like something, Shannon, I won't take it personally. It's more than okay, because it's for you that we do this, for all of us. So Peter, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. As always, I will send a follow-up email within 2 business days containing links to the slides, links to the recording. None of that's going to change. We may not be able to do music for a little bit, but that's okay. We'll figure something out.
Both Shannon and I are musicians, in case you guys don't know. So yes, absolutely. Thank you, guys. See you guys on May 11th.
Perfect. Thank you all. Have a great day and stay safe out there. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Shannon. Bye, everybody. Thank you.